I'm Ken Rockwell with KenRockwell.com, here on KenRockwell.tv, and I've always wondered, I see these things offered for sale, this AstrHori, if that's pronounced correctly, autofocus 85mm f1.8, it comes for Nikon Z, it also comes for Sony, for $249. Is it any good? The good news is it is made all out of metal. These are laser engraved markings, all of them, solid alloy, that feels really good, but how good are the pictures? Let's take a look. This is in the square crop mode of my Z8. It's a Chevy Corvette, obviously. This is at f5.6 at a 1/25th at auto ISO 64 with plus 0.7 of a stop exposure compensation. And I also use Radiant Photo software to, as I oftentimes use, brings up the shadows, gives me a better picture. Looks fine. This is about as close as it gets, though. This is not a particularly close focusing lens, and this is an emblem on the trunk of a classic Corvette. Here's a Porsche Carrera 4S. This is Saturday, the 8th of June, 2024 on my Z8 at f7.1 at 1/200th of a second at auto ISO 64 with plus 0.3 of a stop exposure compensation. Most of these are shot in the program auto exposure mode. I'm just reporting to you the EXIF data because you can't see it here on YouTube unless I told it to you. Hey, here we go. Classic Candy Apple Red Mercedes 300 SL. It's at f7.1 at 1/60th of a second at auto ISO 64. Also with Radiant Photo software to bring up the shadows and make it look just the way I want it to look. You'll see if I zoom in here in the center, at moderate apertures, sure, this lens is super sharp. In the center, at normal apertures, but so is every lens ever made. Here's the interior of that car. This is at f11 to get some depth of field at a 1/30th of a second handheld at auto ISO 72 with plus 0.7 of a stop exposure compensation. The good news is that this lens does work just fine, I guess as all lenses do, with the built-in stabilization of my Z8. It has no stabilization of its own. Here's another yellow Porsche, 22nd of June 2024. This is at f9 at a 3/20th of a second at auto ISO 64, shot from across the street. And you'll see as I zoom in here, again, at moderate apertures like f9, it is super sharp throughout most of the image. But here's the gotcha. What I do like is autofocus works pretty well. We'll cover that. The mechanics feel great, so much better because it's all metal compared to a Nikon lens, which is all plastic. Feels like junk. The problem is for your $250, no, you don't get the space-grade optics of the Nikon or the Sony 85mm f1.8s. And in my particular sample, the right-hand side was always softer. Now, that's a manufacturing defect called decentering. It's common in inexpensive lenses because it costs money to make things exactly right and not throw away the bad ones as opposed to just sell them. But here we go. If we zoom in on the right-handed wheel, you'll see it's just not that sharp. And if you go to my website, KenRockwell.com, and search for this lens, or even better, just follow the link in my description here. I have the original files, so you can go download them to your computer and look at them to your heart's content as if you actually own this lens. I'm going to show you all the specifics, but in a nutshell, the thing about this lens is it has mediocre optics. I'll admit, the first 1961 Nikon 85mm f1.8 had far superior optics. They were sharper, and they even used fewer elements and less technology, yet it was better, probably because the manufacturing techniques were much more precise and controllable. In any case, if we take a look at this lens, problem I have with this lens is there's no mounting index dot. I need to feel for a dot here, so in the dark I can just mount this thing? No. It's got these lines, which admittedly in the heat of actually shooting, tend to go away. I just don't see them. It does have a dot here, but you're never going to see this except here in my studio all blown up super close. So that is a weirdness. The focus ring is relatively strongly damped, but the way it's programmed, it works really well. Autofocus is just a quiet hum from its internal motor, which is very nice. The gotcha is it's the only lens I've ever used where I actually have to program AF fine-tuning, as it's called in Nikon's menu system. I have to use a value of -2 for mine. Yours will probably be different. And once I've done that, then I get accurate autofocus all the time to within the limits of the Nikon system. But at f1.8, it's always dead on. But it's not necessarily that sharp because the lens isn't that great, especially wide open where lenses are softest. This lens is softer on the corners, and it's never really all that brilliant in the center. But as you saw with the sample images, for normal use, for web use, for social media use, which is pretty much the only way photography goes today, works great. If you're shooting landscapes, making 8-foot or 3-meter wide prints, well then of course don't cheap out with this lens. But for the things most people do for $250, if you want to experiment with nice bokeh, and the bokeh in this lens is excellent. Here's a shot from 60 feet or 18 meters away, and it's focused on the BMW logo on the hood. And so the background you'll see even this far away is still really soft and smooth. This is wide open at f1.8 at 1/160th of a second at auto ISO 64 with Radiant Photo software to bring up the dark parts a little bit. And the bokeh is really good. Here's my usual shot from headshot distance. Also at f1.8, this time we had sunlight, not like Pacific Beach June gloom in that last shot. This is at 1/2500th of a second at auto ISO 64 with plus 7/10 of a stop exposure compensation. And you'll see for the reasons that people would buy this lens, which is smooth background bokeh, this lens looks really great for that. So you don't want to use this lens for science, but for art, live it up. If you're shooting movies, the focus breathing is fairly strong. In other words, as you focus more closely, the image does grow. But I can't imagine using this lens for cinema. Coming from Hollywood, people use manual focus rigs, and it's very precise focusing. And there's a guy who's dedicated, or girl, who's dedicated to just pulling focus. I don't see that that's really the case that people do with these lenses. But there is a lot of focus breathing, so I wouldn't use this for drama where you're pulling focus back and forth between two actors or actresses. Manual focus works just about as well as Nikon lenses, but the one thing it won't do is something unique to Nikon, which no other mirrorless brand can do, is even if you're in autofocus continuous, AFC, when you turn this manual ring without making any other changes in the menus, it just says, oh, Rockwell wants to focus manually, and just does it, and then it holds that manual focus distance and leaves it there until you do something else, even in continuous autofocus. This lens doesn't do that. When you go to these third-party lenses, the programming is oftentimes a little bit strange, and everything works great for the most part, except in autofocus continuous mode, it'll continue to try to focus, so it won't work. You'll have to shoot in AFS mode, and then instant manual focus override always works perfectly. Ergonomics, that's one of the best things about this lens. It feels great because it's all metal, and I don't know about you, but I always feel ripped off when I get a plastic lens from Nikon or Sony or Canon or any of those guys. I always feel like, come on, I paid full price. It's not fair. Fall off is not noticeable. Fall off is really good, and strangely enough, the Nikon cameras will correct just a little bit, but even uncorrected, it works just fine. There's no visible fall off. Filters are great because it's all metal and has a metal filter ring. Here's my good BMW filter. Unlike the plastic lenses, it just mounts and screws right in. I love that, like a real lens. Don't feel like I got ripped off. And the good news is, too, I can stack filters about this deep, and I don't get any vignetting. So if you want to use your grads and your polarizers, well, you wouldn't use color balancing filters on digital, but the point is that's not a problem, which is a typical thing for telephoto lenses. Flare and ghost, it's pretty good as flare and ghosts go. The coatings of these domestic Chinese lenses oftentimes are not really that great. You shouldn't see anything when I'm showing you this lens. You should just see straight to the diaphragm with no reflections. The fact that you are seeing some reflections means that the anti-reflection coatings are not extraordinary. The good news is I'll show you later under Sunstars, that the ghosting is really better than usual for a domestic Chinese lens. Shot on my Nikon, I don't see any lateral color fringes, but that's because the Nikon's correct for that automatically. For lens corrections, well, there is no lens correction data, so there's not going to be any distortion correction. It has a moderate amount of pincushion distortion. If it bothers you, and admittedly, I never noticed it until I specifically tested it in my laboratory, but you want to use a factor of -2.6 in Photoshop's lens correction filter. And again, in my written review, I have links to all exactly how to do that. So if you want to go shoot architecture with this lens or straight lines, it works great. Macro performance, it doesn't focus any closer than the lenses of 60 years ago's focused. Its focuses to 0.8 meters. Just like every other 85mm lens, and that's it. So this is as close as it gets. This is at f1.8, and admittedly, it's not very sharp at f1.8. You're seeing spherochromatism, and that's what you get at 1.8, as well as no depth of field. Of course, stopped down to f8, where all lenses are super sharp, then it is super sharp. It doesn't get that close, but it focuses as close as everything else. Spherochromatism, which is where background and foreground things that are out of focus take on colored fringes on their highlights, it is fairly strong spherochromatism. you'll see it's kind of yellowish, amberish in the background, and turns bluish, magenta-ish in the foreground. And that's okay because it never really gets that sharp. But that's what you get. Sunstars, it actually gets pretty good sunstars. It's got a 9-bladed diaphragm. And at least at the smaller apertures, again, the sun is not a point source in this, so you're not going to get really sharp spikes on our Sunstar. But you see it works okay. If we want to compare it, compared to the Nikon Z 85 1.8, which is what, of course, you really want, but it costs 3 times as much, the Nikon Z lens actually weighs less because it's all plastic. The Nikon Z lens has extraordinary sharpness. It's flawless optically. That's why it's so big. And so if you're worried about, I covered this 1,000 times. If you're worried about ultra sharpness, if you're a pixel counter, no, of course you don't want this cheapskate lens. This is for bokeh lovers. It's for lovers, not fighters. Compared to Sony's FE 85 1.8, actually the Sony has optics just as good as the Nikon, what I call space gray. They're just flawless. You can shoot at f1.8. Everything out to the edges is perfectly sharp. Not with this AstrHori lens, but the Sony lens also weighs less. It's the lightest lens there is. It's the most plasticky, but it doesn't cost as much as the Nikon lens either. So for either camera brand, if you want sharp, get the camera maker's lens. If you want a discount lens, it feels even better because it's made out of all metal. Doesn't feel like it's going to break on you, and actually takes good pictures for the things you'd use it for. By all means, check this lens out. The links of where to get it, you can get it direct from China like I did, or you can buy it from from the other places that I use. Again, all the links are in my review. See my online review at kenrockwell.com for all the explicit details, or you can follow the links in my description. And I thank you very much for watching kenrockwell.com here on kenrockwell.tv.